Later, Frank asked one of the Nordics about the metal object from Roswell, and they confirmed it was from a crashed ship. Frank asked, "What made the thing ring like that?" The Nordic man replied, "You already know that we can take atoms apart and put them back together. More importantly, we can make things with perfect crystalline lattices, no flaws, no imperfections, not one atom out of place. That's what that was." The ET went on to explain to Frank that their ship's hulls and other materials have perfectly aligned atoms. On one of the ship's TV-like monitors, the Nordic showed Frank an ET planet with tall buildings constructed using pencil-thin girders. They were made of aluminum or steel with perfectly aligned atomic structures. One pencil-thin girder could carry as much weight as a massive 2-foot square steel girder on Earth. The ET girders are so strong that their buildings did not need to have a lot of straight lines and right angles, but rather, they built with graceful loops, artistic twists, and elegant curves that would be impossible to recreate on Earth with our technology. But there's more. The Nordic said, aligning the atoms makes materials incredibly strong. But most importantly, it can also turn them into superconductors. For this book, we did an online search for superconductivity. The first discovery of superconductivity was by a scientist that cooled mercury and liquid nitrogen to slightly above absolute zero of -459 degrees Fahrenheit or -273 degrees Celsius. To the scientist's astonishment, mercury's electrical resistance almost disappeared. And a permanent magnet would levitate over the frigid superconductor. The ETs told Frank that superconductivity is one of the keys to their anti-gravity propulsion. The ETs said they know how to create room temperature superconductivity in many materials. Based on what the ETs told Frank about superconductivity, he decided to conduct some experiments. He contacted Tony, a chemist that was one of the most brilliant people Frank had ever met. Even though highly intelligent, Tony could get irritated when his experiments didn't go as planned. Frank joked that Tony acted like an amnesiac ET, who knew what is scientifically possible but was frustrated because he couldn't do it with Earth's primitive level of technology. With Frank's financial and technical help, Tony worked for more than a year on the project. The scientific equipment included a specially designed furnace about half the size of a Volkswagen Bug. The furnace was wrapped with massive heavily insulated coils of thick copper wires. It used large amounts of electricity to generate powerful magnetic fields around a crucible of molten aluminum. Sometimes, when Tony first turned on the furnace, it required so much power that streetlights in the industrial park flickered, along with lights in the nearby houses. Some people complained but never found out that Tony and Frank were causing the problems. After numerous failures, they were very disappointed and began to think that their experiment would never work. But then, one day, Frank noticed something very odd. To keep the molten aluminum at a stable temperature, they circulated argon gas through metal pipes around the aluminum-filled crucible, which was heated to about 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit or 650 degrees Celsius. Usually, the metal output pipe carrying the argon was extremely hot when the furnace was on, and it always glowed bright red. However, one day, as Frank leaned over to check the usually red-hot pipe, it wasn't glowing. Thinking something was wrong with the furnace, Frank reached down and rapidly tapped the usually hot tube with the back of his hand. As he did, Tony glanced over. Quickly, he yelled, "Don't touch that. What the hell are you doing?" Tony was afraid Frank would burn his hand. With a puzzled look, Frank looked up and said, "It can't burn anything? It's as cold as ice." Quickly, they checked the furnace but found that everything was working correctly at the correct temperature. The furnace was hot, but the gas was ice cold. Tony and Frank couldn't figure out what had happened. It just didn't make any sense. After letting the furnace cool, they took out the 8-inch long aluminum ingot to inspect it. It looked the same as every time in the past, but it was cold, just like the argon. The two men wondered how that could happen in a red-hot furnace. Then, Frank had a hunch. Holding the ingot lightly by one end, he tapped it gently on the edge of the metal furnace. It rang like a tuning fork. Just like the Metal Gear at Roswell. He looked up at Tony with a big smile and said, "We did it." Eagerly, they sliced off a small piece of the aluminum and took it to a nearby testing laboratory to measure the electrical and thermal conductivity. When the technician handed them a sheet with the results, he said, "What is this stuff? It looks and feels like aluminum. But the thermal conductivity is 180 times above aluminum and 300 times higher than copper. What's going on?" Tony and Frank were dumbfounded. Those values were more than 30 times higher than diamond, the most thermally conductive material known on Earth. Tony looked at the tech and asked, "Are you sure? Maybe your machine is broken?" The tech replied, "I didn't believe it either. So, I checked your stuff 3 times, and the measurements were the same every time. Then I measured a piece of copper, and it was normal. The machine's working fine." The tech tried to be nonchalant but stared at them intently and asked again, "So, what is this stuff?" Tony took the sample and, as he walked out of the lab, said over his shoulder, "I'll have to tell you later." But he had no such intention. When the tech has said 300 times higher, both Tony and Frank understood instantly. The aluminum atoms had become nearly perfectly aligned, almost no atoms out of place, no flaws, no impurities. Electricity and heat could flow through the aluminum with virtually zero resistance. In the furnace, the heat dissipated so rapidly from the aluminum that it remained cool. They were ecstatic. Tony and Frank had created something that scientists had been trying to create but could not. It was something no one had ever seen on this planet, a room-temperature superconductor. The ETs said that superconductivity was involved in the anti-gravity propulsion of their ships. Knowing that connection, both of them were sure this discovery would revolutionize Earth's science and technology. Not long after that, everything changed. When Frank shared their results with the ETs, they told him, "You have to stop your experiments." Thoroughly confused, he couldn't believe what they were saying. He thought they would be happy that they had figured this out on their own. The ETs explained, "If you continue, there are people on your planet who will see your discovery as a threat. They will stop you." Frank asked cautiously, "Now when you say stop, does that mean what I think it does?" The Nordic nodded, "Yes. They will send men to have you killed. They will rationalize by saying such technology will produce severe disruptions in your society, but by that, they mean they will lose control. They won't let that happen." Frank was very disappointed. He thought about all the positive implications of superconducting materials. The ETs told him that superconductivity was also a fundamental key to their ability to produce unlimited free energy. Frank felt that this discovery was one step in truly revolutionizing our society for the better. Superconductivity would eventually mean that there would be no hunger, no poverty, no pollution, and no lack of anything on Earth. Frank was dejected. The Nordic continued gently, "It just is not time yet. There will come a time when they can no longer stop this. That time is coming soon." Not having death wishes, Tony and Frank reluctantly stopped work on the project. Years later, John asked Frank several times about details of those experiments, but Frank would not talk much about them. He would only say, "It still isn't time yet." One day, however, Frank showed John a manuscript that Tony had written describing most but not all of the details of their experiments. They had purposely kept vital information hidden. It was highly technical, and John admitted that he couldn't follow some of it. But there was one interesting page, a faded Xerox copy of the laboratory report showing the enhanced thermal conductivity of the aluminum. It was 300 times higher, precisely as Frank had said. In recent years, scientists have reported high temperature and low temperature superconductivity, but none that operate at room temperature. If achieved, it would be of enormous importance in our present world, leading to much lower cost to transmit electricity. It would also allow much faster computers. Most importantly, it would eventually lead to anti-gravity. In support of the ET's almost magical abilities to work on the atomic level, Whitley Strieber wrote, "One of them once made a very telling comment to a close encounter witness. It told her, 'We rearrange atoms. This is the holy grail of technology. If we could do that, We could make anything into anything. We could create completely novel materials. We could, in effect, do anything,